Hello, everyone. My name is Manas Chawla, and I'm back again this week with the CEO and head of research of Rose and Rubini Associates, Mr. Brunello Rosa. This week, we're talking about about being at the precipice of a new inflation era, and that's the case you've made in this week's newsletter, Brunello. And before we dive into talking about the causes and the consequences of this shift, could you give us a high-level summary of how inflation has evolved the last several decades?
For sure. I mean, inflation is at the center of people's attention at the moment. And so we thought it would be good to start looking back at the various inflation eras of the last few decades. There was clearly an inflation era that started in the 70s. There were several factors behind that. There were, for sure, the end of the Bretton Woods agreement, by which central banks were committed to keep a fixed exchange rate. Instead, they had to change the nominal anchor to the inflation rate, something they were not probably fully prepared for. There was the end of the dollar convertibility into gold, as a result of the Vietnam War, which in fact prompted the end of these Bretton Woods agreements. And then, of course, there were the oil shocks of 1973 due to the Yom Kippur War, and then 1979 due to the Iranian Revolution. And then, something that amplified those shocks, this underlying factor, there was the indexation of salaries and pensions. So the more inflation was going up, the more prices and wages were going up in pensions. And so you had this wage price spiral that is effectively the real kind of driver of domestically generated inflation, if you want, the one that is more consistent and central banks are really worried about. And then subsequently, people realized that it was too much. It needed to be ended. Volcker at the Fed raised interest rate massively, caused the recession, of course, but then inflation collapsed. And then central banks gained operational independence in the 80s and then again in the 90s. And by this combination of factors, we went from an inflation era, 70s, 80s, to a deflationary or disinflationary era of the 80s, 90s, that was further reinforced by globalization that reduced the price of technology and inputs from China and so on. And that lasted until 2020, more or less. Then the pandemic hit and everything changed.
Right. And just to pick up where you left off, the pandemic is clearly a fundamental driver of this inflationary period. And you've said that there's three primary mechanisms that are to blame, namely supply bottlenecks, high energy prices, and labor shortages. Could you break down in a bit more detail how each of these factors has contributed to inflation?
Sure. So supply bottlenecks simply means that supply cannot keep up with demand, and by a very simple economic mechanism, when demand is higher than supply, then prices tend to increase to adjust for this disequilibrium, if you want. Then you had energy prices increasing, and these energy prices increasing derive from the reopening of the economy and the fact that oil prices in particular, and we did other energy prices such as electricity and so on, collapsed at some point in 2020. In April, it went even negative. Then you have a number of other base effects deriving from the fact that VAT was cut in a number of countries, and then after 1 year, this calculation washes out of the index, and therefore this has automatic impact on inflation. So effectively, all these effects tend to have an impact on short-term inflation, which is what we are seeing at the moment.
Sure. And I mean, we've all sort of heard this narrative, right, that these phenomena would be merely transient or temporary. Yet you argue that even once the short-term inflation subsides, there's a more persistent inflationary environment that's bound to emerge. Tell me more. Why is that?
Yes, exactly. I mean, central banks thought that these phenomena would be transient, transitory, temporary. They use various words to describe this phenomenon, but the reality is that it proved to be much more persistent than initially anticipated. But yet, even if it was more persistent, this is what we thought is short-term inflation. And short-term inflation is meant to go down a bit from recent peaks. And yes, central banks expect a peak of 5%, 6%, perhaps 7%, as in the US, and apparently soon in the UK as well. But then, as the supply bottlenecks ease, as energy prices then moderate and so on, base effect are washed out, all these passes, then eventually inflation is supposed to come down a bit. But then a much more worrisome, in our opinion, type of inflation is about to emerge. This medium-term inflation that is due to a plurality of factors. First of all, there will be a more equal distribution between labor income and capital remuneration with profits. In the last few years, we saw the labor share of income drastically collapsing from 55% of the 60s until it reached maybe 40, 45, a total advantage of profits. And that was the result of the so-called trickle-down economic policies that have been adopted by a plurality of countries. Then you have the balkanization of global supply chains. It's not just bottlenecks, temporary bottlenecks, it's the balkanization due to the ongoing trade and otherwise tensions between US and China, the creation of two spheres of influence. And then we have the ecological transition and the technological transition. They are both inflationary in nature. The ecological transition is somehow easier to understand. For many years, green solutions have been considered too expensive to be adopted. And in any case, moving from where we are now to the next phase of energy production will cost money in terms of investment and transaction cost and adaptation cost and all the rest. Technological cost, instead, is a new phenomenon. In the last few decades, the price of technological goods has collapsed quite dramatically. But in coming years, it may actually start increasing, not just because technology might have become more expensive because it's more advanced, more complicated. There might be these micro factors. But the point is that in that balkanized world, we would have a replication of the production of those type of cheap semiconductors and all the rest. They used to be sourced very cheaply from the country that could produce them at the lowest price. But nowadays, nobody trusts anybody else. The US will never buy chips from China anymore because they fear there's a backdoor for government interference, and therefore effectively to duplicate those investments to build domestically those pieces of equipment that those countries are not gonna import anymore from other countries outside the sphere of influence. And all this transition is going to be long and costly, and all this is going to be reflected into the inflation dynamics in the medium term.
And what sort of policy response can we expect to this? I mean, what can we expect from central banks in the coming year?
Yeah, I mean, we saw recently central banks adapted to this new inflation era. The Fed has announced the end of its tapering much faster than initially anticipated, even not just finishing tapering, ending net asset purchases and raising rates all at the same time in March. That's a very quick kind of a sequence of events that can be complemented by a outright reduction of the balance sheet of the Fed in following months. The Fed, the Bank of England has has increased its base rates twice already since December. The ECB has announced the end of PEP, perhaps the only central bank that among the major four has remained a bit more in the past era, if you want, is still the Bank of Japan, because inflation rates remain extremely low there. So they haven't adapted to the idea that there might be, in fact, a new inflation era ahead. And therefore, central banks are somehow preparing for a new era in which inflation is not as low as it used to be, is not below target as it used to be, which has been a nightmare for them. Don't get me wrong. It's been an extreme challenge for them to try to bring inflation up to target, and they try to be as easy as possible, and it didn't work. To some extent, for them, it's easier to bring inflation down to target from above rather than up to target from below, because tightening is the way monetary policy really works. Easing, it may or may not work depending on circumstances. So definitely lots to watch in coming years from central bank and their actions.
Entirely. And I mean, I'm wondering if there's even a further crossover with the politics here, because I'm curious. I mean, do you see these inflationary environments impacting election cycles in this year? I mean, primarily we've got the French leadership elections coming up in just a couple of weeks, the US midterms later in the year. What's the interplay there?
It's a very interesting question. Not many people are thinking that way, and there might be, in fact, crossover effects. I mean, inflation is clearly at the top of people's mind in a number of countries. Unfortunately, governments are not very well equipped to deal with inflationary matters. And central banks are not either, if those derive from negative supply shocks, because the central banks can deal with demand in general and demand shocks in particular. And as I was saying before, there were periods in the past in which central banks they tried to react to a negative supply shock, as it was the oil shock of the 70s, and the only thing they could do was engineering a massive negative massive negative demand shock, which was a recession, which is like killing a mosquito with the bazooka. But if it's the only option available, unfortunately, central banks would resort to that. Governments can do something to some extent, in the sense that there are regulated prices that they can act on. Clearly, the production of oil is very much a decision of governments, especially OPEC, OPEC Plus, and so on. So there's something they can do, and clearly easing international tensions would help, not fostering further this balkanization of global supply chains. But unfortunately, these are very complicated decisions to be made. The international composition of all these desires, so to speak, from politicians is very complicated, and therefore, unfortunately, that we will probably have to live in the next few decades with rates of inflation, I would say, structurally higher than they used to be in the last few decades.
Entirely. Lots to watch out for this year as we sort of see this momentous shift. But thank you so much for your time and insight, Brunello. Always super useful.
Thank you. Till next time.